So for now, I'm going to go through kind of the stakeholder organizational stuff, and I'm going to talk a little bit faster. I've drug on too long with some of the other content, but try to get us back close to on time. So basically, let me get back to my slides here. The goals of the watershed plan are to address those impairments and other concerns. And ultimately, we would like to achieve a consensus in what gets put into the watershed protection plan. A consensus-based approach has proven time and time again to be more viable in developing a plan than I get my way versus you getting your way type approach that is all too common in the world today. And ultimately, the goal is to come up with a plan that everybody's going to be willing to implement in some capacity, and then actually be able or willing to support going forward. So some of the keys to developing successful watershed plans are to involve a diversity of interests. And just looking at the participant list today, I feel like we've got a pretty good view of the interests across the watershed. Obviously, not everybody that should be here or wants to be here could be, but that's our goal, is to involve as many folks as we can in this process, and really to come up with a collaborative approach to making decisions that will basically serve multiple goals and priorities across the watershed. At the end of the day, though, we need to use sound science and accurate information to base these decisions on. And that really gets back to a lot of that local input that we are looking for in this process. We can use the best available data sets out there and build a plan and not ever talk to anybody in the watershed, but that doesn't behoove us to have an effective plan to be built out that way. It's way better for us to work with everybody locally to validate these things and make sure it's appropriate, make sure it's palatable at the end of the day. And really, again, build that consensus around the components that go into the plan. So really the goal is to get everything to a point that everybody is good with or can live with. Obviously, each tiny aspect of the plan may not be perfect in your respective eyes, but if it's something that we can all get behind and really be okay with, then we're in a good spot as far as plan development is concerned. And really we want to be able to make sure that these goals and objectives are easily communicated out and communicated well, so people understand what's going on, why it's going on, and all that good stuff. And then come up with some things that can be done pretty quickly. I know a lot of times through these planning processes, people often will say, I'm tired of planning, let's actually go do something. And that's really one of the primary goals of these plans, is to identify some of those things that can be done relatively quickly to get things rolling. So just to highlight what a stakeholder is, I'm sure most of y'all already know this, but basically it's a group or individual who has a stake in the watershed. And by that, it could be just a concern, or they own land, or they have a business there, or they like to recreate there, or so forth and so on. So basically it's anybody who wants to protect the water body, work to restore the water body, or relies on that water body for their livelihood and things of that nature. And the types of stakeholders are very diverse. It could be all the way from an individual that owns a house in town or a bunch of land, all the way up to an agency person in a state or federal agency, and all points in between. So there's no particular groups or individuals or anything like that that are excluded from the process. This is literally a melting pot of personnel, if you want to call it that gets rolled into these stakeholder groups. But some of the major tasks for stakeholders in these efforts to develop project plans or watershed protection plans is to provide guidance on those potential pollutant sources and estimated pollutant loads. And then it's to set the goals and objectives for the plan, and then guide the management measures that get recommended and included in those plans. And then to also help identify what level of outreach and education is needed at the local level. And then ultimately to basically oversee and be involved in the implementation of the plan once it actually gets developed. So really the goals for today are to talk about the organizational structure and some of the decision-making approaches to facilitate the plan. I know I've already kind of talked about what has worked in other places, but there are options. We don't have to do it that way. But one of our goals is to kind of talk through that a little bit, and then to highlight some of the various roles of those groups, and then make a recommendation for what we think would work going forward. And that's not me making a recommendation, but everybody collectively providing input and coming up with an approach that should be done. So the form and all will be used to gain that feedback, just because we're not in person. So Claire's going to post a link in the chat box, and I think we're also going to be emailing that link out after the meeting today. So the WPP Stakeholder Group Framework can take multiple different forms, and some of the more common approaches are to break things out into working groups to focus on specific issues. So this would be groups of like-minded stakeholders that talk about those specific issues. So for wastewater, we would have our wastewater treatment plant operators and potentially septic system groups. We could split those into 2 separate groups if we wanted to. But basically, we get those like-minded individuals together, and they meet more frequently over a short period of time to really kind of hammer through some of those priority issues and come up with solutions for their respective work group focus. So the other approach or another division is what we call a coordination committee, and typically this is what's considered kind of the decision-making body of stakeholders, and we attempt to include a diverse interests or diverse backgrounds in these, and oftentimes we prefer to have representatives from each of the work groups that might be formed serve on that coordination committee to make sure that the content from those work groups is being appropriately translated into the full document and things like that. So these coordination committees meet less frequently perhaps, but they'll meet as needed to discuss decisions that need to be made. So oftentimes we'll have a kind of a kickoff meeting like this, then we'll break into work groups and really hammer through some of the more detailed information, and then convene that coordination committee after those work groups have kind of made their initial recommendations. And then the coordination committee may meet monthly or quarterly or something like that, just depending on how fast they prefer to move along. And those meetings are generally open to anybody and everybody. The work group meetings, we try to keep them not closed door, but relatively small, just because if the group gets too large, it gets a little unruly sometimes, and it's, I guess, less efficient to manage a larger group. So those working groups, our preference is to have them smaller and more manageable, but the coordination committee obviously can be a larger, more diverse group and more open to anybody and everybody. And then the last is really just kind of a general stakeholder group or watershed protection plan stakeholder group. And this is just a general body of individuals who participate in public meetings, and it may be more made up of people that just want to stay informed as opposed to be actively engaged in the planning process. So these are more broad informational type meetings, much like the stuff we've kind of talked about today, where it's kind of big picture 30,000 foot elevation type content that gets presented. So really from I guess our perspective at the Water Resources Institute and just history of developing watershed protection plans across the state, what our recommendation is that we use the combination of the working groups and the coordination committee to really drive the development of the content of the plan and determine what needs to go on or go into the watershed protection plan. And the bullet points there just kind of outline some of the, I guess, anticipated or expected meeting schedules that these 2 work groups would provide. And again, this is our recommendation. We certainly want input from y'all via those forms on telling us your preference. But like I said, over time, we have used this approach time and time again, and it seems to work fairly well, especially for larger watersheds where you have a broad range of interests and a broad range of sources as well. It seems to be more effective to have those like-minded individuals talk about specific solutions to address that source and not really focus on anything else. So again, just that's our recommendation. So take it for what it's worth and provide us that feedback in that form that we'll be sending the link to y'all momentarily. So I guess a little bit more information about a coordination committee is that coordination committee is really the core group of watershed stakeholders. And the goal of that is to have members that are equally representative of all the watershed stakeholders in the watershed. And really, this is a group that actively coordinates amongst the larger stakeholder group and really their mission is to identify those desired water quality conditions, prioritize the programs and practices, and then review and comment on the content that actually gets developed and written down on paper, and basically say, yeah, we want this to go on for further review down the line. So this is just some thoughts on prospective committee members or coordination committee members. And this, we don't have any specific names or anything, but this is more just entities or types of people that should be involved. And this is probably not an all-inclusive list. In fact, I'd put money on it that it's not all-inclusive. So again, we need your input on who else we should be working with or reaching out to include in the as a potential coordination committee member, should y'all go that route. So again, this is some of the feedback that we want to get from y'all via the form. Make sure to let us know if there are some other groups that need to be engaged in the process. I feel like we've done a pretty decent job of engaging a broad group of people, especially given the fact that folks like Ashley Morgan and Kirsten and everybody else that's operating there locally has helped spread the word about this process. So people have at least been exposed to the information and given the opportunity to participate. But again, if there's somebody else that you think really should be involved, please do let us know. And if you've got their contact information, that's even better. So the working groups, really their goal is to focus on those work group specific issues. So if it's a livestock based work group, they're going to focus only on recommendations for management that address livestock related bacteria sources. They're not going to worry about septic systems or wastewater treatment plants or pets or anything like that. And really their goal is to hash through those issues and work with the facilitator of the work group to come up with that content that's specific to that work group that gets recommended to be included in the plan. So some of the possible working groups, and this is just kind of a list of work groups that's been used in other watersheds that you could consider, are listed there on the left-hand side of the page, and they've ranged from the plain and simple to the overly complex in some cases. But just given the nature of the Petronila and San Fernando creeks, that we've basically are suggesting 4 different work groups here. One being stormwater, one being ag and rural concerns. So rural concerns could be like wildlife and or habitat and things of that nature. And then a wastewater and septic, and then a monitoring and science work group. So those are the recommendations, and they pretty much cover the broad nature of potential bacteria sources and even the nutrient sources across the watershed. And again, that's our suggestion. So please do provide some input on if y'all think those are a good suite of recommendations, or if you think there's something else that should be added or one of those that should be adjusted along the way. And again, the work group structure, our preference is to keep the representation adequate across the board. So we definitely want to include everybody that needs to be included in there, but we do want to keep the size more manageable, and then have at least a couple of work group members serve on the coordination committee as liaisons to provide that direct connection between the work group and coordination committee. And then basically we'll have those guys play by the same set of rules that everybody else plays by as far as content development and things of that nature is concerned. So last section here is the decision-making process. And I've alluded to this a little bit already, but the decision-making is quite important in the development of these plans. And really the way that decisions get made affects the efficiency of the development of the plan. You can have a lot of decision makers or not enough decision makers, and there's a happy medium in there. If you get too many people that are tasked with making decisions like ultimately what goes in the plan, that can be terribly difficult to navigate. But if you have too few, it doesn't reflect the diversity of the watershed and the interests that go on out there. So it's a fine line in there as far as what the right number to engage is. But basically, our goal is to keep it as broad as necessary, but not have it to get to a point where it's unruly or anything like that. But ultimately, we need to make sure that all of the interests in the watershed are adequately represented and have a voice at the table and have the ability to weigh in on what goes into that watershed plan. So the decision-making processes have ranged from very informal all the way to very formal, like you would run into at a commissioner's court meeting where they adhere to the Open Meetings Act and things like that. So those formal arrangements typically have an established set of bylaws that govern the actions of the committee. They do adhere to those Open Meeting Act requirements, and they have a formal vote of designated coordination members only. So there are named people that have a vote on what goes into the watershed plan. And there also has to be a quorum present for official business to be conducted. The informal approach or a less formal approach typically uses just a set of ground rules to kind of put some bumpers on the lanes at the bowling alley, if you want to call it that, that basically just says, all right, this is how we're going to operate things. This is our general approach. And the goal there is to have most all stakeholders represented or those groups represented in meetings. And in some cases, in some watersheds, we've even gone so far as to seek feedback from folks that couldn't make meetings via email and phone calls to them directly. And the decision making there is made more via consensus as opposed to voting. So there's not formal voting members, but everybody has a chance to weigh in on those decisions that get made and what gets included into that watershed protection plan. So some examples of ground rules that have been used in other watersheds, Geronimo Creek, they basically went pretty formal with their ground rules. They had goals, powers, timeframes, designated people identified by name on who was in that steering committee, who voted, who didn't, things of that nature. And then on the other side, you have the upper Gulf Coast oyster waters. They use a fairly informal approach where they didn't have a formal voting committee or anything like that set up. And they basically just said, let's all play nice in the sandbox and talk through these things and be respectful and come up with decisions that best suit the watershed. So these are just some examples of what could go on. Our approach in most watersheds has typically been on, I guess, a more informal approach to things where we do have a set of ground rules that we put together, and if that's a route y'all want to go, we can draft up some of those ground rules or use some from other watersheds that we've used in past projects to send out, and basically we use that as a guide on how those decisions are going to be made, and ultimately. The consensus-based approach is what has proven to work best from our past projects. The formal vote by named voting members, it's functional, but in many cases you start to see divisions of people within those groups and things like that, and certainly it provides more opportunity for things to turn sour. But with the consensus-based approach, it provides more of an opportunity to talk about things and kind of talk through the issues, and in most cases, people want to end up at the same goal at the end of the day. They may just be looking at it from a slightly different perspective and not realize it. But that consensus building approach gives us the opportunity to really go through that and work through it. So again, our recommendation is to use that informal approach and use those work groups to really hash out the content that's specific to that work group, and then use a coordination committee to review that content and determine what goes into that watershed plan via that consensus building approach to things. So with that, I believe that's my last slide. Yep, that's my last slide. So if there's any questions about anything I've talked about, especially I guess the stakeholder structure or any of the last couple of presentations, definitely chime in on those, and if not, Claire's going to cover our next steps and timeline right quick, and then we will get y'all out of here right at noon.
We just had a couple comments, a little bit more about the septic system. So Coastal Benson Bay's estuary program talked about what they were collecting, which wasn't bacteria data. And then someone was looking on Google Maps and thinks that there's about 250 to 300 septic systems along the developed shoreline. So just thinking that that could be a significant impact for bacteria. So it might be good to look at.
Certainly.
And then,
yeah. I was going to say, with septic systems, proximity to water bodies is also or always a big concern. So obviously those septics that are closer to the bay itself or closer to the creek, if one of those systems is failing, it could have a significant direct effect on water quality. Whereas if you have a system that's 10 miles from the nearest waterway, if it's failing, yeah, it's still problematic, but there's that whole distance thing there that naturally mitigates a lot of those pollutants and creates less of a direct effect. So it makes a lot of sense to address those that are closer to the problem first.
And then we had someone else who's working on a NSF project and has some bacteria data from 2 sites in Baffin Bay, and they said they'd be happy to share.
All right, thank you, Dorena.
Those are the only kind of question comments that I've seen. Also, Lucas had been mentioning that form for stakeholder interest. So now that y'all have heard that presentation, I'm going to go ahead and already post that link. So you can kind of already open it up, but definitely fill it out, especially if you're interested in participating in work groups or the coordination committee, so we can capture that data. So that's the first one on my next step. So please make sure you fill out that online form, because that really helps us kind of finalize that structure, create those work groups. And we'll make sure to reach out to those groups specifically to find a meeting time that works best for y'all. So that's going to be our next step within the next couple months from March to May. We're going to look at hosting work group meetings. COVID restrictions are still kind of up in the air with meetings for us traveling from A&M. So it might be virtual. If it could be something where we could travel to, we'll work with y'all. It depends on the size and kind of what's available for folks, but that's something we'll decide with those specific smaller work groups. Next slide. So I just wanted to remind y'all again about the upcoming event that Ashley spoke about at the very beginning, that water quality and fisheries presentation that's going to be next week from 6 to 8 p.m. I know she posted the RSVP link in our chat form. I saw a question come through too. So you are not automatically registered just from attending this meeting to this educational program. So you do need to go through and re-register, so you'll get their specific Zoom information. And she just posted it in the chat again, so that's perfect. It's right there if y'all wanted to sign up and participate. Next slide. So this is just kind of overall timeline for what we're looking at with this project. So again, starting right now, we're organizing and getting some work group meetings to really delve down on some of the information that we're going to use to develop the plan. We hope to have a coordination committee that's going to be open to the public to talk about those work group recommendations by the summer. And then most of the summer is going to be developing our first draft watershed protection plan. Then in the fall, we hope to then have another meeting that's open to the public to present that draft plan, get some feedback. We may be sending chapters out throughout the summer for folks to review through email. And then it's a lot of kind of back and forth with editing the WPP with our funding agencies. But really, we're hoping to be able to wrap this up by next spring, so May 2022. So we're trying to do this quickly, so you know, we don't spend too much time on planning when people are anxious to start implementing. So we want to be able, so it's going to be quite a few meetings in the beginning to get this plan started, and then hopefully then we can go right into implementation after we get the plan accepted. And then, so with that, I just want to remind y'all about our project website, twri.tamu.edu/BaffinWPP. That's where we're going to post all the recordings from today's meeting, as well as the form. If you have any other questions that you think of afterwards, please reach out to me or Lucas. I'll also send out the emails of our other presenters who are doing work in the Baffin Bay area for any additional questions that you might have for them. So with that, if I know we didn't leave as much time for general questions, but if you have any other final questions, please put it in the chat. I'm going to post our form one more time in the chat, so please go ahead and fill that out right now. I'll include it again in our follow-up email, but we definitely need y'all's feedback, and it's hard, you know, online to see nodding heads and get kind of our feedback. So the form is our best way in the online world to know that everyone's on the same page with how we're going to move forward.
Yeah, and I would add that feel free to email us directly or call us directly. like Claire said, it's really tough for us to get feedback from folks on these virtual platforms. They're obviously great and have helped us continue to do things like this with all the COVID restrictions that are in place. But it is tough because, I mean, a public meeting, you're going to have conversations with people before and after where you get tons of great feedback, and this just doesn't lend itself to that. So please do call or email with any questions or comments or concerns or anything like that. And my personal cell phone number is on there, so use it. Primarily, we're still semi in the office, semi not in the office here at A&M. So please do use that. I would ask to leave a message if I don't answer the phone. I'm getting slammed with spam phone calls these days, so I'm bad about not answering the phone if I don't recognize the number. But I will call you back if you leave a message and tell me what it's all about. So I promise you that. But thank you all for participating in the meeting today, and please do provide that feedback via the form, like Claire said. That's really going to help us hammer things out and figure out the path forward on this that works best for everybody locally and makes the most sense for everybody. And again, feel free to reach out to us anytime with questions, comments, concerns, or anything like that. And we will be in touch soon with further information on next meetings and things of that nature. And again, thank you for your time today. Hope you have a great rest of your day and stay safe out there.
Thank you.